Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Victoria Geronimo. I work at Second Watch as a product manager for security and compliance products. And today, I'm going to be taking you through CCPA and how you can provision your infrastructure and consider it when trying to comply with the law. I know it's super exciting. All right. So just the abstract, like I said, it's not just CCPA, there's also GDPR. There's also multiple laws coming down the pipeline at a state level. So really what happens is, how do we make sure that we are complying with these laws? How do we know what data we have? How do we make sure we know where it is and how to delete it? All right. So first, I'm just going to go over CCPA, GDPR. These are the ones that are in the news right now, but just want to stress that they are not the only ones. Nevada has a data privacy law. Massachusetts will be coming out with one. And it's really important to start thinking about it now so you can efficiently adopt your infrastructure to it. We're going to talk about some commonalities, some differences, and then just practically speaking, okay, this is what the law is, but how do I translate this into a technical control and to a pipeline? And then just some foundational considerations and how you can leverage current AWS tools in order to comply. So first of all, do I actually have to comply with this law? Probably yes, especially if you're doing any sort of data. CCPA, it's, am I collecting something about a California consumer? Then I have to comply. GDPR is, do I have data on a European citizen? Then I have to comply. There's a few particulars here when it comes to things like, am I collecting more than 50,000 or is my revenue above 25 million? While those are some specifics, again, because these laws are really popping up in every single state, the real benchmark should be, is this person from that state or are they from the European Union? So at their core, GDPR, CCPA, the Nevada law that came into effect a year ago, they're all essentially privacy laws. Privacy, first of all, sort of dictates security, which in turn dictates compliance. Privacy is about control at its core. So it's giving the control of the data back to the consumer itself. It's saying, hey, I'm a consumer. I want to be able to know where my data lives and where it's going to go and whether I even want you to sell it or not. Privacy is ensured by proper security, so you can't have privacy if you aren't enabling certain tools in order, like encryption, to segment data, IAM policies, et cetera. And then compliance is sort of at the end of the thing, where it's how do we measure compliance for security. So if you have the correct security controls, then you should be having all your compliance checks met. Whoops. All right, now some basics and nitty gritty. I actually have a legal background, so this to me is like my bread and butter and I love talking about it. I won't go too much into every single part of this slide. If you want to talk to me more about the nitty gritty of the law, see me at booth 213 afterwards. But essentially, both of these are giving the consumer the right to know what data you may have about them, as well as what you can do with that data. So CCPA is really saying, hey, I want to be able to opt out of you using my data. GDPR is, I want to opt in or opt out. So one is affirmative and one is an opting out of it. The GDPR goes a little bit further into saying, not only do I have the right to say, please don't use my data, but I have the right to know exactly what data you have about me. And I want to correct it because maybe like my last name isn't correct, or maybe you have something that I don't agree with. So it actually gives consumers the right to ask a company to change data that they have about them. So really what this means is you have to enable your infrastructure to be able to find that data. These are just some of the scare tactics. So essentially, GDPR is going pretty hard into finding companies. I think Google's been fined 3 times already, upwards of millions and millions of dollars. 2019, I wrote this in July. At that time, British Airways under GDPR had about a $230 million fine. Marriott for their data breach, also a 723 million, and then Google 57 million, and I think they just got another fine, and they are also being searched again. So GDPR is not only going after European companies, but they're really going after some of the big whales in America. CCPA, it is by violation, which is by record. So those fines can get pretty hefty, because if your database is breached and you have a violation, 10,000 users could mean a $25 million fine. The other part about CCPA that's new is it gives California residents standing to sue. So prior to CCPA, say if there's been some companies with huge data breaches, only the Attorney General of that state would be able to sue them. So you would have to wait for the Attorney General to actually go ahead and decide. Now it gives individuals the standing to sue. So if you aren't protecting data or you aren't responding to data requests, now an individual and multiple individuals have a right of action against you. So it just makes the attack for a lawsuit higher. So what does this mean? How do I now map my infrastructure to do this? And there's 5 different phases that I've identified. One of them is the assessment phase. So you're going to be looking at, what data do I have? Is it PII? Where is it? You also want to do a tagging strategy. That is one of the biggest things, is tag everything. Know exactly where your data lives, where it's moving to. After that, you want to develop a notification mechanism, and that's really relating to the request. So you have to, under these laws, make sure that you have a way for consumers to directly request from you what information you have on them, as well as whether they want you to delete it or not, or alter it in any way. You also need the purge mechanism, which is, how do I now delete this data after I have validated this request? And lastly, you need proof. So the auditing phase, and it's not just proving that, hey, we complied with it, but it's also validating requests. So kind of one ironic part of this is that there's been privacy violations of people trying to comply with the law. So for instance, I think it was in the EU a few months ago, somebody made a request, what data do you have on me? My name is Joe Brown. And they sent him back all of the data that they had on Joe Brown. And it turns out this guy was actually Mary. And they were able to actually get data from people, and it was considered a data breach. So even though they were trying to comply with the law, they never actually validated that the person requesting this data was actually that person. So you want to make sure you have all the logs of validation. All right, so phase 1 in the assessment. This is one of the most important things you can be doing. It's going to be the data mapping phase. So what data do I have? These laws pretty much go for PII, personally identifiable information. There's a bunch of different definitions for PII, but it's essentially anything that can sufficiently identify somebody. So like a first name and a last name, an address, something like that, an IP address. Is it within the scope of GDPR or CCPA? How do I use that PII? So, if you're just using it, it may fall into an exception. So maybe somebody makes a request of you, hey, what data do you have on me? I want you to delete it. If you're using it to carry out the terms of your contract, so like you need them, you need their address still to actually bill them, then you can deny their data subject request, because you need to keep that PII in order to keep the business running. And then which resources are touching PII? So what databases is it living in? Am I using anything that is enriching that data? So once you have that assessment figured out, basically what data do I have, where does it live, what resources are touching it, then you can start to figure out how to implement this next phase, which is your tagging strategy. This is the other big one. So you want to make sure you know exactly where your data lives. You do this by tagging. There's a lot of different ways that you can tag data depending on which resource you're using. So Amazon DynamoDB, RDS, Redshift, they all have capabilities to organize and tag data with it. Amazon S3 with the object metadata. just depending on what environment you're using, the size of your databases is which one of these you're going to use. And then you want to find a way to automate it as well, and monitor for compliance of automation, so using like AWS config to make sure that you're actually adhering to your tagging strategy. Then you need your notification mechanism. So again, you can use AWS config for continuous monitoring to make sure you're tagging everything, but then on top of it, you want to make sure that you are using something like SES to be emailing with the consumers, responding to their requests. So not only should you make sure that you have a portal for them, but you have to make sure, hey, we received your request. We are currently looking into it for you. And then you can also have an opt-out Amazon Connect, which is something that not a lot of people are currently using, but it's pretty cool. It basically gives you an automated call center. So somebody can call you, say, hey, my name is so-and-so, I want my data deleted, and Amazon Connect will register that and automatically put it into a database for analytics. Then you also have your purge mechanism. So this is sort of where it gets a little bit complicated. The most important thing is that once you've mapped your data, that you also have a way to find where it is, enrich it, and then be able to make a query for it, and then purge it out of your system. So you can use Amazon EMR, which is going to help enrich it, AWS Glue, which will help enrich it. Amazon Athena for developing queries, and especially now, more and more people are going to be using S3 data lakes with their announcement they had. You can also query the data lakes for it. And then Amazon QuickSight, which is essentially just giving you a big dashboard to look at everything, know exactly where it is, easy to use. And then last, proof. The biggest thing for proof is going to be your CloudTrail and CloudWatch events. You can also use serverless AWS Lambda in order to track them. All right, so other considerations that are at play here. One thing that to note is that because CCPA, GDPR are new laws, there's going to be some gray areas that are still unclear. So under CCPA, GDPR, there are certain exceptions. So say if you, like I said before, have a business reason for needing to use the data, and somebody asks that you delete or alter that data, you can deny them based on, hey, this is a business use. One thing that is unclear is something like backups. If you have a data backup or something in AWS Glacier, do I need to delete that? On one hand, we think of backups as a security concern. Hey, I need to make sure I have my system completely backed up, and I don't want to have to go into them and delete a snapshot just because I got a request. That's my backup system. So that is still a gray area. Long-term data storage as well. And then also with geography, with GDPR. So depending on where you're located, where your servers are located, it may or may not have to comply with the law. So GDPR goes across borders. So just because your data centers all live in the US, it's still, if you have something on an EU data subject, then you have to make sure you're complying with the law. Just because everything is physically in the US does not mean that you don't have to comply with GDPR. So just to wrap this up, the key performance indicators for whether you're compliant and on the road for compliance, one is going to be your data flow diagram. You need to make sure that you can show somebody, hey, this is where our data lives, this is where it's collected, this is where it goes to, and then this is how it's being used. CCPA calls out data mapping as one of its primary indicators of whether somebody's actually being compliant. And it's also going to help you guys implement these next steps. Also, fielding information and deletion request functionality. Again, you can use various tools in Amazon like AWS Requests, AWS Connect to actually field these requests. You're going to need like a portal on your website, an opt-out button, etc. And then also your notification functionality. And then last thing, the continuous logging and monitoring. So in order to make sure you know that you're actually complying with GDPR and CCPA and all these other laws, it's data flow diagram. You need to make sure you're mapping and tagging your data. You need to make sure you have a functionality for fielding requests, for getting back and validating those requests with the consumer, and then logging and monitoring all of this that's happening. All right, so just the initial questions to ask yourself. If anything, when you leave this session, what you really want to make sure, the first steps you're asking yourself, what data do I have? Is it PII? How did I get this PII? How did I collect it? Consent is going to be a big thing, so you have to make sure that all of this data is actually, you have now asked for consent, you've listed out all of these use cases, and the consumer has clicked a button that said, I consent. Where is PII located? So geographically, where is it being stored? And then lastly, where is it replicated? Where is it transferred? And if you know those things, then you can make sure you're purging everything out. All right. And thank you very much. So does anyone have any questions?
And if you do, I can bring you the microphone. We got one over here, it looks like.
Yeah, actually I have one question. So for the unspecified data, for example, if I have some click URL recording, but I know this is data, but I don't know which user this data come from. Does this kind of unspecified data need to be clearly put on our website or notify the users?
So you're asking, do I need to ask my consumer? So really what you need to do is you need to tell the consumer on the website, and this isn't really CCPA, GDPR, but you do need to have, according to other laws, privacy policies that detail how you're using their data. With CCPA, GDPR, it's kind of affirmative consent. You need to be listing all of the use cases, and then what data you're collecting about them, and then how you'll be using it.
Okay. So, for example, if the user visit our website and they have a lot of click, glance, and anything they clicked, but I know this data recorded to our cloud, but I cannot specify this data was connected to this user himself, which means if you didn't recognize any account on our website, we have no idea this click are from you. So. Yeah. Okay,
so that is not subject to CCPA. Another clarification they actually just came out with, it's a little different than what you're saying, but anonymized data does not fall under CCPA. So it's essentially if you cannot tie it back to somebody, then it's not subject to CCPA or GDPR.
Gotcha. Next question, sorry. The second question is about, for example, I use some kind of like a Google analysis, which means this kind of data was building app, but when this data was not only connected to us, but maybe also shared by Google, we have no idea. So actually in this kind of situation, if the user asks us to delete their data, we can delete the data stored in our app, of course, but we cannot sure, we have no idea whether this data has been collected by Google either. So does this comply to CCPA, or what should we do?
Yeah, so actually under CCPA, there's also a aspect of it that they are allowed to request what third parties are you sharing my data with. So they have the right to ask you that question. So you can say, hey, I'm selling your data to Google, or I'm sharing your data to Google for this purpose. Then it's on the consumer to contact Google themselves. You're welcome.
One more, just one in the back.
Hi, I come from the So I come from the shared mobility industry. Like my company sells electric bike and electric scooters. Electric scooters mean like Vespa. And of course, we collect data from the telematic that is slapped onto the e-bikes and e-scooters. Now, the problem is our e-scooters are in Europe. And we have our app, and our consumers who buy the scooters register their PII, all identifiable information, and once they register that, the data comes into Virginia data center in AWS. And then subsequently, once they ride the scooters, the telematic sends the GPS data, which again gets tied into the Virginia data center.
Okay.
So everything comes into US. No, I'm pretty sure there is some violation we are doing from a GDPR standpoint. So can you give me some idea on this? Like, should this personally identifiable information should reside in AWS region in Europe in order to comply with the GDPR?
So no, you can bring it to the U.S. There's no border restrictions on it, especially in the advent of cloud computing. They're kind of moving away from that. It used to be the case that you couldn't really move something from one data center to another. So you could have it in US, but it really, you have to make sure that you're comporting with GDPR principles, which are the European residents know you're collecting that data and they've consented to it. And it's not just consented to the collection, but it's consented to the particular use cases.
Sorry, we're going to just be able to take one more because we have to wrap up.
But should we ask them, or as in a form of a form that the data is in US? Because one of the clause in GDPR is that data should not move out of the European geography. That is one of the compliance or one of the rules.
Yeah, so GDPR is all about transparency. So yes, you should give notification on where that is. However, you are able to move it cross-border.
Sounds like we could keep going.
I know.
Well,
Like
and
the
the
law.
good news is you can keep going because they will happily talk with you at the booth as well, yeah?
Oh, yeah. Come see us at booth 2013.
All right. Very good. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria.